before I start reading chapter 12, I do have a question. I want you guys to raise your hand and don't just blurt out the answer, okay? Before I start, can any of you recall who the first old gal in the ditch was? Can you tell me? Okay. Can you predict who you think the second old gal in the ditch will be? Okay, anybody else? Okay. Any other predictions? Do you have another one?
Yeah. Pearl. Oh.
Pearl? Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Chapter 12. Another old gal in the ditch. Seemed like Tansy was never satisfied. If it wasn't orthography, it was looking at meanings. If it wasn't looking at meanings, it was geography. Then history, then I don't know what. Now it was numbers. 6 is to 8, as 12 is to that kind of thing, which was irritating to me. Tansy had an arithmetic book that was, or the Western calculator from the high school. She pored over it at home in the evenings, keeping a day ahead of us. At this rate, we'd be looking at multiplication tables before the month was out. The weather was still hotter than hinges, with only a glint of goldenrod. Me and Lloyd slumped to school through clouds of midgets, but already Aunt Maud was introducing winterish hot oatmeal into our breakfasts, and her hot oatmeal tasted like pullet mash. Attendance at school was good here before harvest. I thought every day would be Glenn's last, but he was still Johnny on the spot. And Tansy kept coming up with new ideas never heard of in school teaching. Seemed to me if she'd been trained right as a teacher, she'd stick to the rules more. But she combined spelling school with geography and split us into teams to name all 45 state capitals and the territorial capitals and spell them. So we started off Thursday morning spelling each other down. And you couldn't look at your map. You had to know which we said wasn't fair. I dreaded what she was setting up for me. And what about Glenn, who couldn't spell his own name, let alone a capital city? As things turned out, it never came to that. Pearl nearing, Tansy rang out, Iowa. Pearl got an easy one and sneered. The capital of Iowa, she said, happens to be Des Moines. Capital D, E, capital M. Clang went the cowbell, down went Pearl. Russell Culver, Tansy smiled slightly, Florida. I sighed. The capital of Florida is Tampa. Capital T, A. No, it ain't, said several. Suddenly, everybody was an expert. It's Tallahassee, piped Little Britches. I know it, I whined, but I can spell Tampa. Tansy reached for the cowbell to give me a double clang when we all heard a sudden sound from outside. A splintering of wood and a screech, then a howl from J.W., all louder than the crack of doom. What now? Tansy spoke under her breath. We all crowded outside. J.W. was cowering against the school with one paw up. Looked like he'd had a nasty shock. The plank across the ditch had split under the weight of a real big, real old lady. Her bonnet was askew, and she was flat on her back, waving a cane. My land, she was enormous. She'd make Tansy look like Little Britches. She was down at the bottom of the ditch, but her bosom was level with the road. And mad as a hornet. You couldn't hardly follow her, but it seemed to be, somebody will pay for this, and pay through the nose, and if I ever get out of this ditch, there are some who will wish to heaven I hadn't, things like that. She was spitting like a bobcat on a chain. Tansy pushed through us and looked through the ditch. Oh no, she said, Aunt Fanny Hamline. Some of you were right. I thought we'd need a block and a tackle to lift her, but getting Aunt Fanny Hamline out of the ditch became one of Tansy's most famous days of teaching. It was a lesson in engineering, too. It should have been studied at Purdue University. We needed rope and sent Lester as the smallest boy up the bell rope in the tower. Being puny paid off. And up he swarmed with his Buster Brown collar with a knife in his teeth. He whittled away at the rope above him, and when it snapped, we were in a bunch below to catch him and the rope. Getting it under Aunt Fanny took longer. Squaring off in the same teams as State Capital Spelling School, we started above her bonnet and slipped the rope under, sawing back and forth to get it down to the middle of her. Not to her waist. She didn't have a waist. It was heavy work, even with all hands at it. The hardest part was staying out of range of her cane. And noisy? You brats is rubbing all my skin off my backbone. And I'll have the law on every one of you, individually. And you can run, but you can't hide. And I know where you live. Things like that. Once her cane swung too near Glenn. He grabbed it out of the air and flung it in the road. And that slowed her down some. When we got the rope centered, our problems began. She wouldn't sit up, and we couldn't budge her flat. We heaved and we hoed, and we got nowhere. If one team heaved while the other team was hoeing, she'd begin to revolve. If somehow we happened to flip her over on her front, she could drown in the ditch. There was always some standing water in the ditch, even in dry weather. This would quiet her, but then she'd come back to haunt us. We were getting right down to the end of our rope, so to speak. Just then the mailman, Mr. George Keating, making his regular rounds, drew up. We seemed to come as a surprise to him. Aunt Fanny stretched out full length and hollering from the ditch. All 8 of us pulling at her with the bell rope, like tug of war. The cowbell still in Tansy's fist. Mr. Keating ran a hand around the back of his neck, saying, and I thought I'd seen everything. If it hadn't been for the mailman, Aunt Fanny would still be in the ditch. We decided to tie both ends of the bell rope to the back of his mail wagon. Though Aunt Fanny Hamlin outweighed his horse, with all 8 of us and Tansy pushing the wagon and pulling on the rope and the horse straining and pawing the road, we showed some progress. Aunt Fanny began to skid on wet weeds. Her bosom moved like hedgehogs, just even with the road. Then she was skidding sitting up, her bonnet still askew. Then she was on her feet, tramping the ditch at a brisk pace and trying to work out the rope around her before the horse broke into a trot. Even on her feet, it was no Sunday school picnic lifting her out of the ditch. But 4 of us behind and 4 of us before, and finally Aunt Fanny staggered up on solid ground. There wasn't a whole lot left to the back of her skirts, and she was drenched with ditch water all up that side. We retrieved the rope, and Mr. George Keating went on his way, no doubt to spread the word. Somebody found her cane. J.W. slunk off in search of quiet. Aunt Fanny herself was nearly winded. It had been a workout for a woman of her years and size. Her breath came in wheezes, but she returned to life pretty quick. Without invitation, she stomped into the schoolhouse, filling it up. We followed. Some of us had never set eyes on her. She lived in her house in the grove since right after the ark came ashore, and she was but seldom seen. It was said that she never left her place for fear somebody would charge her money or something. So she was tight, they said, that she was so tight, they said, she would sit out under a tree on a hot day to save the shade on her porch. Cheap? She'd skin a louse for its hide and tallow. What's this place supposed to be? Aunt Fanny pointed her cane in various directions. This is a public schoolhouse, said Tansy, as you know. Well, it don't look anything like one to me. Where's the American flag? The taxpayers haven't seen fit to provide one, Tansy said. I take it you're a taxpayer? Aunt Fanny jumped on that. Girl, I'm the biggest taxpayer in Sycamore Township, and maybe Park County. And I get the least for my money. Who are you supposed to be? I'm the teacher here, Tansy said. Piffle, said Aunt Fanny. Mert Arbuckle was the little end of nothing whittled down to a fine point, but you ain't even. Don't talk down to me in front of my pupils, Tansy warned. Who's to stop me? I am. Tansy held her ground, and Aunt Fanny faltered. We gaped. It was hard to see Tansy around her. There were ferns plastered to Aunt Fanny's whole backside, and a tuft of dark fur. Minks like wet ditches. We wondered if she'd flattened one. State your business, Tansy said, pretty pert. I have teaching to do and knowledge to impart. Well, impart this to your so-called pupils. Tell them to keep off my property. One or more of you is trespassing and stealing from me. Aunt Fanny seemed to address the bracket that used to hold the map. Her eyesight wasn't up to snuff, and she naturally wouldn't pay for spectacles. I don't see like I did, but they's bound to be your bunch, and they's gigging my frogs. Tansy looked around her at us. Anybody here gigging Aunt Fanny's frogs? Pearl, have you been gigging Aunt Fanny's frogs? Since a gig is a pole 5 foot long with a metal sticker on the end of it, you couldn't really picture Pearl with one in her hand. Neither could Pearl. Certainly not. I have never laid a finger on a frog. The idea! None of this has anything to do with me. She patted the enormous bow on the back of her head. Aunt Fanny looked thunderstruck. Who's that stuck-up little Floyd Lumley? Tansy called out around her. Have you been gigging Aunt Fanny's frogs? No, Miss Mert, Flop-Ears sang out. Aunt Fanny's old pink-rimmed eyes popped. Well, she ain't the sharpest tool in the shed, is she? Is he? She observed. We saw what Tansy was up to. She was wearing down Aunt Fanny one so-called pupil at a time. Luckily, there was no string of frogs hanging out by the hat this particular morning. Though, of course, they wouldn't have been gigged. They would have been brained by a slingshot. Aunt Fanny's half-blind gaze swept teacher's desk where Little Britches and a Baldwin apple worked. She didn't see either. Glenn had brought apples for all this morning. We didn't know where from. I've got apples coming on from the trees up by my house, Aunt Fanny imparted to us, and I have every one of them apples counted. Believe it, we did. And I'll tell you all something else for free. She rapped her cane on the floor. I may be blinder than any bat, but I've got me a government-issue rifle. It was the one my husband, Mr. Hamline, carried when he fought in Captain Lilly's 18th Indian Light Artillery at Chickamauga. Her husband, Aunt Fanny, had been married? Lloyd went pale at this page. And I can lock and load while you're looking for your feet. If you can outrun a bullet, come see me. Otherwise, keep off my place. She turned to go, and her skirts made a rusty sound. We fell back, and Charlie came in the door. We'd been too occupied to miss him. In his big hands were the 2 halves of the plank across the ditch. Somebody saw this plank half through, he announced. We blinked, and some of us remembered the snake in the drawer. Charlie remembered, except for Glenn, who came in through the grove. We'd all crossed the plank this morning. Tansy, too. And she's no wood nymph, as I've mentioned, but Aunt Fanny must have been the last straw, so to speak. And now you're trying to kill me, she said, or cripple me up for life? Out she went, but turned back at the door. She pointed an old bent finger sighted down it and cocked the thumb. Just try me, she said, and then she was gone, more or less in a puff of smoke. Okay, now can any of you guys tell me, or can you explain to me why Aunt Fanny is so upset with the students or the school? What are some of the reasons she'd be upset? Yeah.
Because one of the students, Glenn, went through her grove, and she's trying to figure it out now.
Okay.
She was mad at the students because Glenn was going to the orchid and gigging her frogs.
Do we know who it was? Do we know who was gigging the frogs?
Well, yeah, but Glenn carried them out.
Yeah, Glenn just saw him
It
slingshot
says-
and brain, and he never did one.
Well, it said that if it had been them, they wouldn't have been gigged. They'd have been brain shotted or brained by a slingshot.
Because somebody's taking her apples.
Okay.
Because we know that it was friends because that Russell said that they weren't gay, they were hit by a slingshot.
Okay. What do you think?
Because she thinks it was their fault for her falling into the ditch.
Okay.
And my wasn't that she fell in the ditch.
Okay. Do we have any other ones?
Because somebody that goes to the school there had been gigging her frogs and taking apples.
Okay.
And she's a really gushy lady.
Okay. Those are good answers, guys. Okay, this was also the day I finally talked Charlie into heading off for the Dakotas, no later than Saturday night. I pulled out all my arguments in favor of this enterprise. At last, Charlie seemed to stir at the salary of $17 a week for the threshing season and keep. We'd get there for free as long as the freight trains ran. I liked the sound of riding the rods, however you did that, but it was the $17 that seemed to win Charlie. Still, it was harder than usual to get him to concentrate. The sawed plank and the puff adder preyed on his mind. I told him to put the whole business behind him, and school too. All right, he said at long last. I'm tired of hearing about it. Saturday night. A thrill shot through me with some fear in it. Now that Charlie had caved in made it real. We'd have to sneak off without goodbyes. Charlie was of legal age to quit school, but I wasn't quite. Anyway, sneaking off was part of the deal. We'd slip out of our houses after everybody was in bed, meet up, and make for the Montezuma, for the Monon freight train that went through late. Up in the Chicago yards, we'd find us a train of the Great Northern Line. I knew it by heart. Boys from these parts went up every year. Remember, wear your winter suit under your overalls, I told Charlie. I spelled it out to him. You had to. You don't want to carry anything in your hands. Bring eats in your pockets. You got all this? He claimed he did. So finally, we were on our way to the big skies of the Dakotas, and to the Red River Valley the American Nile. What could stop us now? Okay, so do you think that Charlie and Russell will actually leave for the Dakotas? I want you to justify to me your prediction. Tell me why you think they will or will not.
I don't think that they will because they'll chicken out if they have so many reasons why they shouldn't go to the Dakotas. What if they get arrested or something because Russell Holker is not of legal age?
Okay, what do you think?
I think they're not going to go because Russell will be caught by Nancy.
Okay,
Just thinking out.
okay. What do you think?
I think that they will go because it's been their dream. It's been Russell's dream for a long time. And
Okay.
they finally convinced her.
To go with them? Okay, what do you think?
I think that they won't, because if they do and they make a lot of ruckus, JW will just run out and start barking.
Okay, what do you think?
I think they'll get halfway there and go to the Chicago yards like they were talking about, and then they'll get homesick and try to come back.
Okay. What do you think?
I think they'll get caught because when they try and go and sneak out, JW might bark and they'll tell that there's something wrong and they're trying probably to sneak out and they'll get caught by their dad or kids.
Okay. We're going to do one more. What do you think?
I think that they won't go because JW will follow them if he wakes up, and then in the morning everybody's like, "Where's JW and Russell?"
Okay.